Much has been said about William Landrum Mitchell, more commonly known as Billy Mitchell, and his series of tests in 1921 against various target ships using air attack. Many have claimed he was a prophet, scorned in his day by traditionalists, but ultimately correct. And at the other extreme, some have accused him of underhanded measures, twisting the truth and outright lying to present a case that simply didn't exist. Let's take a look at what actually happened and see if we can unravel it all. Firstly, just who was the man at the centre of all the fuss? Billy Mitchell had joined the US Army amidst the Spanish-American War, although he actually ended up being deployed to the Philippines after the US had forced Spain to cede control to them, which had immediately resulted in the Philippine-American War. After that, Mitchell had been assigned to various signals-related postings in the United States and become an early fan of the then newfangled flying machine, rising through the ranks of what would become the aviation section of the US Signal Corps, the predecessor to the US Army Air Service, itself the predecessor to the US Army Air Force, itself the originator of the present-day US Air Force. The entry of the USA into World War I would see him both fly in operations over the front lines and command the US aerial units that were involved, gaining him much public acclaim for his actions, but already starting to form a somewhat more hostile relationship with his superior officers. Returning home, Mitchell fell victim to a degree of internal army politics. There was a movement, which Mitchell approved of, to try and make the air service independent, and the army had moved to have one of its more ground-based officers appointed as head of the air service in an attempt to try and retain control of it. The air service, which would later become the Army Air Corps and then the US Army Air Force as mentioned earlier, would gradually gain more and more independence over the interwar period before emerging in 1947 as the US Air Force, but that's for more air-minded historians to cover in more detail. Mitchell, of course, not only wanted an independent air service, but, much like the Royal Air Force was about to do to the Royal Naval Air Service Fleet Air Arm, he wanted this group to have control over pretty much all air power, land and sea-based. And it was at this point that he really started to get into a feud with the US Navy. The US war plans, going forward at this point, didn't really have all that much to say on the use of aircraft for the defence of the United States. This was perhaps understandable. The first transatlantic flight had only just been made, and that was over the shortest possible portion of the North Atlantic, had been one way, in a bomber loaded to the gills with fuel and with no other payload, and the poor thing had ended up nose first in an Irish peat bog at the end of its flight. It was therefore fairly reasonable to assume that unless there was a war with Canada of all places, aircraft were not going to be flying over to bomb the US that decade or indeed any time in the foreseeable future, at least in terms of the life cycle of US war plans. If the enemy could not reach the US by air, then logically it followed that there was no particular need for large-scale anti-aircraft gun emplacements or large numbers of aircraft for coastal defence. There was the chance that a small number of aircraft arriving offshore by means of the newly minted aircraft carrier could cause problems, but that was viewed as a Navy problem, since such vessels would no doubt be operating alongside a battle fleet, and that was of course what the US Navy had its own battle fleet to deal with, and thus any use of air power by the United States was necessarily going to be of a purely expeditionary nature. Mitchell, however, declared in public that, should the Air Force be destroyed, the enemy has practically unhindered access to the country. Quite how they were going to do this remained unstated, a theme that you'll come to recognise in a lot of Mitchell's statements. By the end of 1919, he had moved on from this to asserting that an Air Force, on its own, would be capable of defeating an entire enemy invasion fleet, no Navy battle fleet or Army coastal defence artillery required. He also insisted, in response to the objection that even if all of his promises about the effectiveness of dropping tons of TNT on ships from biplanes were true, a simple fog might then just hide the fleet from sight until it was too late to do anything about it, or, the sun might set, with the following statement. In the unlikely event that the fog and vapour surround the enemy fleet, Making accuracy of aim from above impossible, the genius of the Native American has been able to devise a means of clearing the very heavens of such matter. This is an absolutely new sphere of control over nature's domains, and sounds like the dream of some opium addict rather than the cold, clear achievement of science. Yeah, about the only part of that statement that makes any sense at all is that last bit about the person saying it having perhaps consumed a little bit too much opium. He would then go on to claim that he could have 1,000 bombers for the price of a single battleship, although given his own later statements on the price tag of losing a single bomber, that was a figure that was inflated by around a factor of 5 if we're being generous. But his pitch was to try and establish the purchase of even a mere 500 bombers as a bargain price compared to what he styled as an expensive and obsolete platform in the form of a battleship. And so, in early 1920, he set out his plans to defend the US coast with aircraft. Firstly, using Zeppelin-like large, rigid airships, an incoming enemy fleet would be located and its position radioed back to shore. Second, these airships and enemy airships, which presumably had come with the fleet, would fight it out over said fleet for control of the skies, although he was a little less clear on how these Zeppelins were supposed to fight each other. Thirdly, this airship battle would inevitably lead to a further battle between fighters as the enemy fleet launched what aircraft they had, and fighter, or in US terminology of the time, pursuit aircraft, arrived from land bases to contest the skies further. Fourthly, due to the greater capacity of land bases, in theory the US forces would win, even if it was only by force of numbers, and thus they would establish control of the air. Fifthly, the pursuit aircraft were then to repeatedly strafe the enemy fleet to prevent them using anti-aircraft guns. Sixthly, waves of bombers, each formation 100 strong, would saturate the enemy fleet with 1,000 and 2,200 pound bombs dropped in formation from altitude. Seventhly, if the attack waves of level bombers had left anything still afloat, there could be torpedo bomber attacks to finish off the survivors. And eighthly, if there were any survivors after that, US submarines could be called in and directed from the air to finish them off. If the enemy happened to attack at night, or in a time of fog or cloud, then, presumably after the magical cloud clearing device had also allowed the airships to spot the fleet, the aircraft would drop flares to illuminate the targets for attack. He also insisted that the US Navy should be made to scrap their program of flying boat bases, which it was in the process of establishing for the purposes of aerial recon all along the US coastline. Not because they wouldn't be effective, but simply because they wouldn't be under his control. This was then followed up by a declaration that the air service would soon have an aircraft capable of carrying 6 1,000-pound bombs, which would then give each aircraft half a dozen chances to hit a ship. In fact, at the time, the MB-1 bomber, which had recently been introduced into US service, could barely get off the ground with a single 1,000-pound bomb aboard, and the NBS-1, or MB-2, which was just about to enter service, could manage short distances carrying 2 such bombs. In fact, the air service had no such plans at the time that Mitchell had made his statement, and it would only actually be 2 months afterwards that the air service would put out a contract for the design of a heavy bomber that could carry 5, not 6, 1,000-pound bombs. This would result in the XNBL-1, a 6-engined triplane which, if actually purchased, would have cost as much as a battleship if you only bought 24 of them. And in the end, the sole prototype proved a massive disappointment, only capable of reaching out about 170 miles from its home base and taking about 2 hours to get there. It was also completely incapable of climbing to an altitude that would allow it to clear the Appalachian Mountains, and unsurprisingly, it was never put into production. Mitchell at this point was already getting pushback for these and other misleading statements that he'd made, as well as his attempts to use these statements to influence government policy. At the same time, though, the US Navy had independently decided to conduct some bombing trials, since a growing school of thought in naval circles was that their own aircraft, especially those deployed off of future aircraft carriers, might be useful in crippling or otherwise impeding enemy ships, which would make them an easier target for the battle fleet. For this purpose, the old pre-dreadnought Indiana was converted into a target ship. The tests had a twofold purpose. Initially, there would be a 3-day exercise with seaplanes dropping dummy bombs at the anchored vessel to test different bombing formations and, to a limited extent, bombing techniques. This would allow the Navy to optimize the attack profiles and let them calculate, roughly speaking, how many hits you could expect to achieve for every 100 bombs dropped. For this purpose, the outline of a much larger and more modern ship was also sketched out around the anchored pre-dreadnought, so that near misses on the real ship that would have hit a more modern and larger vessel could be noted. In clear skies from 4,000 feet, unopposed against an anchored target, the final total of hits wasn't that bad. Around 10% of dummy bombs physically hit the old pre-dreadnought, and another 30% had landed nearby within the area that would have been occupied by a much more recent and larger vessel like an Omaha-class cruiser or a Tennessee-class battleship. Next, a series of live bombs of varying sizes were physically placed in the sea at ranges between 75 and 25 feet from the hull to determine the effects of near misses. The sum total effect of these explosions was one of the hull plates sprang a leak when one of the largest bombs was detonated about 30 feet away. Typically, that wouldn't have actually been any danger to the ship, but she'd been so thoroughly stripped before being handed over as a target that Indiana lacked any real watertight integrity, and so she began to slowly settle, albeit at the rate of about 6 inches every hour. Mitchell, of course, would later on claim that these tests had disabled the ship's rudder and propellers, which was completely untrue. The Navy, however, decided to tow the gradually settling ship to a nearby beach and proceed with the next stage of testing, which involved placing bombs that ranged in weight from around 200 pounds up to 1,800 pounds, the latter of which could only be carried by the NBS-1 bomber, and even then only one at a time, onto the deck of the ship, and then the bombs would be detonated to simulate what would happen if the bomb had hit the ship directly. After each explosion, a Navy assessment team would go aboard to check out the damage and make notes on what might be done to improve a ship's survivability in the face of such aerial attack. The smaller bombs did essentially nothing, and the big 1,800-pounder was placed next to one of the wing-mounted 8-inch turrets. This rather spectacular high-explosive bomb, which was about half explosive by volume, did some quite visually impressive destruction to the superstructure and the funnels. But when the investigators clambered over the wreckage, they found that the 8-inch turret itself, which, it should be borne out, the bomb had landed, simulated, of course, right next to, was absolutely fine, bar a few electrical cables that had been knocked loose and would take a few minutes to put back in. Although the ship would of course have lost speed due to the damage from the funnels, its actual fighting capability wouldn't have been that adversely affected. The Navy concluded, to quote, "The damage to material from aerial bombs was local. Personnel in unprotected positions within the blast area would be destroyed, but personnel enclosed in armoured turrets would probably not be incapacitated, and considering the probable effect of defensive gunfire against aircraft at the low altitude necessary to be accurate with heavy aerial bombs against a rapidly moving target at sea, the entire experiment pointed to the improbability of a modern battleship being either destroyed or completely put out of action by aerial bombs." Mitchell, of course, declared that the tests, somehow, proved that even with a near miss, he could blow a battleship to pieces. The Navy countered this by pointing out that the Air Service had yet to actually hit a single ship with a bomb of any size, as the tests against Indiana had been conducted by Navy aircraft, and they no more proved the supremacy of the bomb any more than firing a torpedo or a salvo of shells against the obsolete stationary and undefended target would have proved those weapons' superiority. Indeed, the old USS Massachusetts had recently been actually sunk by coastal artillery fire in a test nearby, and no one was claiming that coastal guns were therefore the arbiters of all sea power in the future. Of course, shortly thereafter, the admittedly visually spectacular Pictures of the damage to the Indiana were leaked to the press, and although no one could prove it, most people were pretty sure who was responsible. Mitchell was off promoting his latest scare story to Congress. This time, he was telling everyone how an enemy aircraft carrier attack could wipe out the population of New York using poison gas. Although where exactly an enemy aircraft carrier, or even a fleet of them, was supposed to fit the several thousand tons of phosgene gas bombs that were necessary for such a task, according to his estimations, was again not mentioned. He did, however, also advocate for turning 3 old German liners into aircraft carriers, which I suppose was a good thing. The embarrassingly short range of contemporary bombers had become more and more apparent, which meant the idea of being able to move the airbase, and so therefore the aircraft, closer to the target, was becoming something of an obvious benefit. As arguments in front of various congressional committees raged back and forth, the Navy pointed out that tests against an obsolete stationary target were very different to a moving vessel aiming to defend itself in the open sea. Mitchell, however, replied that it would in fact be easier to hit a moving target in the open sea. When challenged to explain that one, he stated the following, suggesting that perhaps the science of objects in motion, or ships in general, was not exactly his strong suit. To quote, "It does not make very much difference because we employ a massed attack. A ship on the surface of the water in motion is much easier to hit than an object at rest because the relative speed between the airplane and the object being fired at is the thing that makes it difficult to secure hits. If a water vessel could be moving at the same rate as an airplane, there would be absolutely no trouble whatever about hitting it because all you would have to do would be to get over the object and drop the bomb, and as both the airplane and its target would be going at the same speed, you would be certain to get a hit. Therefore, the faster that a water vessel goes, the easier it is to hit from the air. This is not understood at all by people unfamiliar with bombing. As to turning to the zigzagging, the turns of surface vessels of any kind are so slow as to be almost negligible from the air. Yep, ladies and gentlemen, apparently hitting a vessel moving at 100 miles an hour would be dead easy, because the aircraft, also moving at 100 miles an hour and having presumably teleported into position above the ship, since of course if they're both moving at 100 miles an hour, there's no way the bomber can actually catch up to the ship, would then simply drop its bomb directly overhead, and since, as we all know, all bombs are clearly made of spherical cows and dropped into a vacuum, they would either, by their own means of inertia, or presumably with some form of propulsion and an immunity to air resistance, fall, relatively speaking, straight down, which would in fact be forward, because of course both target and bomber are moving, maintaining a uniform forward speed and thus strike their target perfectly. About the only correct part of his entire statement is the inference that a ship moving at 100 miles an hour would find it somewhat difficult to turn, although of course that wouldn't be true at actual sane speeds. He then went on to state that the high explosive bomb was the best weapon possible for destroying ships. The armor-piercing bomb and the torpedo were less effective, he argued, on the basis of having less explosive per unit weight compared to the high explosive bomb. Yeah. He then further announced that he had the men, the aircraft, and the bombs ready to sink a ship if the Navy would just hand over some targets. This came as quite the surprise to the Air Service, who at this point, in early February 1921, were only just about getting the first few NBS-1 bombers operational and were in no way ready or trained for a mass strike against shipping. But these grandiose statements had been made in public, and so Mitchell would get his tests, albeit not entirely to his specification. The Navy had already planned to follow up the tests on the Indiana with tests on a variety of German ships that had been handed over at the end of World War I, plus potentially using the old pre-dreadnought USS Iowa, which had been rigged as a radio-controlled target ship, and thus might be able to answer the question about hitting a ship underway. In the face of public and congressional pressure, the Navy formally invited the Army Air Service to either observe or take part in the tests. For those tests, the submarine U-117 was allocated to be sunk by air attack, which would take place on the 21st of June 1921. The next day, several other U-boats would be attacked by destroyers, Then on the 26th, there would be the search and attack exercise on the radio-controlled target ship Iowa. On the 13th of July, the ex-German destroyer G-102 would be bombed. Then on the 18th, the cruiser Frankfurt. And finally, on the 20th and 21st of July, it was planned to attack the SMS Ostfriesland. She was at least a dreadnought-type battleship, but she was also a Helgoland-class vessel whose contemporaries were already considered obsolete in naval service. Rather embarrassingly for Mitchell, the first thing the air service then had to do was ask the Navy to loan them its bomb sights and bombardiers, since the Army lacked both the bomb sights and the officers trained to use them for bombing over water. It also turned out that the Navy's bomb sights were generally actually just better than the handful of bomb sights that the Army had for their own purposes anyway. Mitchell then commenced practicing against the stranded hulk of the Indiana, although initially without actually telling the Navy he was doing so, and this was done in order to get his aircrew's eye in. He then decided to try and move on to target the obsolete pre-dreadnought USS Kentucky, which the Navy had agreed in principle to hand over as a guinea pig, since a 2,000-pound bomb that Mitchell had recently been championing was in fact still experimental and needed testing before anyone went to the trouble of mass-producing them, let alone hauling them out to sea to drop on things. However, the Kentucky was found to be in such poor shape that the Navy refused to hand it over at the last minute. Apart from being a somewhat unrealistic target, being a pre-dreadnought, there was some question as to whether it would even survive being towed out to sea, such was its condition. Another pre-dreadnought, the Alabama, was technically also available and in somewhat better shape, but she'd need stripping out of valuable recyclable components first, and that would take some time. Discussions now began regarding the details of the tests. No one expected the U-boat or the destroyer to survive for very long if they were hit, but the Navy made it clear that they did want to examine the Frankfurt and the Ostfriesland after each attack wave to take detailed notes on the effects of any hits scored. They stated that Mitchell was, of course, free to destroy the old German battleship, just as long as the Navy got to document the process at each step of the way. Otherwise, little new would be learned from the tests, other than if you put enough explosive into a ship, it would potentially sink. Mitchell then tried to take control of the tests entirely, only to be told in no uncertain terms that since this was a Navy exercise the Army had been invited to, he could either submit to the Navy's terms or he could get lost. In light of the leaks of information that had occurred following the Indiana tests, everyone involved was ordered that no information was to be released without prior authorization from senior officers. To clear up any confusion as to who exactly this might be directed to, Mitchell was personally instructed to comply and also instructed to personally acknowledge receipt of these particular orders in writing. Mitchell then nearly got himself fired anyway for trying to politicise the tragic crash of an aircraft which had been brought down by a thunderstorm, killing all those aboard. He barely scraped through that incident, but he did manage to pull together enough aircraft from across the United States to form his first Provisional Air Brigade in time for the tests to begin. The tests started off with a fairly strong showing for air attack. The U-117 was attacked by 3 Navy F-5L flying boats. On their second pass, coming in at 1,200 feet, they scored 2 hits for the total expenditure of a dozen bombs. The submarine sank so quickly, taking less than 10 minutes to slip under the waves, that the next wave of aircraft from the Army Air Service turned up to find only an expanding ring of air bubbles and debris. The next test for which aircraft were to be involved was of course the hunt for the USS Iowa. The purpose of the exercise being to determine if aircraft, loaded up under wartime conditions, which obviously included the carriage of bombs, could actually find and attack a ship before said ship reached its target. The exercise was made slightly easier by, instead of just leaving aircraft to patrol the entire US East Coast, they were told that the Iowa was somewhere in a box 200 miles long and 50 miles wide, with the box starting 50 miles offshore and ending 100 miles offshore, which meant that the ship was about 2 to 4 hours steaming, if it was a modern battleship, from wherever it was to pretty much kissing the shoreline. The 200-mile dimension was, of course, north to south, and started in the north at Cape Henlopen and ended in the south at Cape Hatteras. This meant that, in theory, a bomber would have about 3 to 4 hours to locate the target before it could completely attack its objective and begin withdrawal, which of course would represent a failure to defend the coast. This was the perfect chance for Mitchell to demonstrate all aspects of his claims. And so, of course, he backed out, forbidding his aircraft from taking part on the grounds that the fuel pumps of the new NBS-1 bombers would give out after a mere 2 hours in the air. Instead, he asked if the ship could be moved closer to the shore to start with, which was refused on the grounds that a ship that was that close would already be in bombardment range before the bombers, alerted to its presence, had even cleared their own coastline. Instead, the search was undertaken by a mix of US Navy flying boats and a trio of Army non-rigid airships, which would at least simply just float there waiting for rescue if they happened to have an engine failure. It took these aircraft about 2 hours to find the Iowa, in which time one of the world's faster capital ships, Nagato, Queen Elizabeth, or pretty much any battlecruiser, would have already long gotten into bombardment position. And then it turned out that the 2 airships which had found her didn't actually have powerful enough radios to tell anyone about it except for each other, which meant it would be almost another hour before one of the flying boats managed to stumble across them, find the Iowa, and call its friends in to attack. This resulted in a total of 85 practice bombs being dropped, but even with the Iowa gently rolling along at a mere 6 knots without trying to evade or fight back, the number of hits scored was vanishingly small. A couple of weeks later, it was time for the ex-SMS G-102 to be a victim. This time, the Army Air Service would be the only ones who attacked, with Mitchell showing his great faith in the brand new American NBS-1 bomber by leading the attack in a British de Havilland DH-4. The attack was carried out in great style, with the Atlantic Fleet circling around as spectators. First came 11 British-built SE-5 fighters, each of which was armed with machine guns and a series of small fragmentation bombs. These made a number of shallow dives down to about 200 feet, where they each released a bomb and a spray of gunfire, which simulated suppressing any theoretical anti-aircraft defences. And although the ship was completely stationary and the release altitude was so low that hitting the ship's mast was actually a real danger, half the bombs still missed. Then came a flight of 16 other DH-4s at 1,500 feet, dropping a series of 100-pound live bombs, and after much churning of water, it was revealed that every single bomb had missed. Then came 15 NBS-1s, each carrying half a dozen 300-pound high-explosive bombs, which were to be dropped in 3 passes, 2 at a time, also at 1,500 feet. 2 bombs, which landed right next to the ship, had little apparent effect, but as the attack progressed, another bomb landed just at the base of the forward funnel and behind the bridge. This clearly did something, as a huge plume of smoke shot out from the funnel, or possibly displaced soot, most likely the result of a shockwave and fragments driving down the funnel and into the engine room. And as the ship began to sink rather rapidly, another hit to the second funnel sent the ship under 20 minutes after the first bomb had been dropped. On the one hand, a warship had been sunk. On the other hand, it was an 1,100-ton destroyer, which had absorbed the attention of an entire squadron of fighters and almost 3 full bomber squadrons for most of the morning. On July the 18th, it was the turn of the cruiser Frankfurt to be on the target list. A mixture of Army and Navy aircraft lobbed 300 and 250-pound bombs respectively at the ship starting at 9:30. By lunchtime, 38 bombs later, the attackers were ordered away so that the still floating cruiser could be examined. This done, the attacks resumed. 17 more bombs were dropped before a trio of NBS-1s showed up and sent 7 larger 520-pound bombs downrange. The ship was still afloat and was boarded once more so that the damage could be recorded. While the party was aboard, another half-dozen Army aircraft appeared. They'd taken off without permission and were now running out of fuel. In the interests of watching more explosions, the inspection party made haste to leave, and these aircraft then started in with 600-pound bombs just after 4 in the afternoon. 10 bombs were dropped, resulting in a pair of hits that didn't seem to do all that much, But the 11th bomb landed in the water adjacent to the starboard bridge wing, and as the plume of water subsided, the cruiser could be seen to be down by the bow and sinking slowly. The Navy evaluation was that the blast effects of even the 600-pound bombs were quite limited. A single decent armour deck would protect ships from adverse effects to their primary fighting capabilities, but the one that had dropped nearby had acted a bit more like a mine, perhaps unsurprising given that the 600-pound demolition bomb carried a similar charge to the common Mark VI naval mine, and thus anti-aircraft armament would be needed aboard cruisers to keep such bombs away from ships in the future. Then, of course, was the main event. The plan was to start bombing Ostfriesland at 0900 on the 20th of July, and much like with Frankfurt, after a given number or type of bombs had been dropped, parties would go aboard to assess the damage. An all-clear signal was devised which would be displayed on the forecastle of a nearby transport, with strict orders given that no attacks should commence until that signal was deployed, and if it was deployed mid-exercise, all attacks should be broken off. Otherwise, the damage assessment team might be caught aboard the ship by the next wave of aircraft. To make things ultra-safe for the bombers, the Navy would daisy-chain destroyers from shore to the ship to act as a waypoint guide markers, and a pair of Navy flying boats would patrol the route just in case any bomber went down with mechanical issues. The schedule called first for a number of 14-inch armour-piercing bombs to be dropped. These, of course, went against Mitchell's ideas of more explosives being better, but others had prevailed to at least test the idea. As some of you might have guessed, these were essentially US Navy 14-inch armour-piercing rounds with tail fins strapped to them. Then there would be a series of attacks with 230-pound bombs, then another wave of 550-pound bombs, then 600-pounders, and then 2 waves of aircraft each carrying 1,000-pound bombs. The next day, half a dozen bombers would attack in 2 waves, with each bomber armed with a single 2,000-pound bomb. This got off to a bad start when poor weather meant a low cloud base. This was too low for the 14-inch AP bombs to gain enough speed to be truly effective, and with the seas too rough to board the ship, everything was delayed until lunchtime when the seas had calmed down, but the cloud base refused to lift, and so the 14-inch armour-piercing bomb test was cancelled, and they decided to just proceed with the rest of them. With the lightweight bombs dropped, the observation teams went aboard, and in view of the time, just after 2 in the afternoon, it was decided they were going to skip the 550-pounders initially and move straight to the 600-pounders, partly because the bombs were of similar weight, and also because the 230-pound bomb attack had been conducted by Navy and Marine aircraft. The 550-pound bomb attack was also scheduled to be done by Navy aircraft, whereas going straight to the 600-pounders, which would be to be dropped by Army aircraft, would allow the Army to actually make an attack that day, as it was likely the weather would close in again at some point soon. However, it turned out that someone had ordered the NBS-1 bombers aloft half an hour earlier than when they were called, and so they showed up in attack formation while the observation teams were still aboard. Luckily, the pilots this time around had the good sense to check for the all-clear signal, which wasn't in evidence. But even at this short distance, barely 50 miles offshore, the bombers were already running low on fuel, and they advised they had at most 40 minutes before they would have to return to base, and the observation team were thus forced to wrap up their assessments rather rapidly and leave in haste. The Navy aircraft, armed with 550-pound bombs, which had been rescheduled to go after the Army aircraft, weather allowing, were also ordered into the attack, following up on the Army aircraft directly. The Navy aircraft ended up doing somewhat better. Their attack pattern was for the lead aircraft, equipped with the most experienced bombardier, to make its drop, with all other aircraft flying in formation, releasing their bombs when they saw the lead aircraft drop its first bomb. This allowed them to score 4 hits for 8 bombs dropped, while the Army aircraft, which came in singly and dropped 1 bomb per attack run, managed to miss the completely stationary battleship with 10 out of their 11 bombs. Most of the bombs that actually hit simply smashed themselves into oblivion on the ship's decks, but with the threat of being bombed by their own side now past, the damage assessment teams made their way on board. They now discovered that looting by pierside crews after the ship had been stripped down meant that almost every bulkhead hatch and door was open, and some of them had even been removed entirely, which left the ship completely lacking in all watertight subdivision. They closed what doors they could, but they were on something of a time limit, and their main job was to assess damage, not play around with hatches and doorways deep in the ship. Of the damage, there was actually fairly little to see. Only a small amount of damage had been done to the ship's upper works, the most notable thing being a hole in the forecastle which had been made by the lone 600-pound bomb hit, which had managed to disable a couple of secondary battery positions. But nothing had even reached as far as the ship's armour deck, let alone troubled it. However, they did notice something else. Potentially a near miss from one of the bombs, or possibly part of a major flooding of the bunkers caused by valve failure while she was being moved to the test zone, had opened a seam in the forward boiler room, and that was making the ship list to port, which of course wasn't helped by the aforementioned lack of any watertight boundaries to contain the flooding. But that was all they had time for on the day. The next day, even without any damage control, pumps, or most of its watertight doors sealed, the Ostfriesland was still afloat, albeit it was down 3 foot by the stern, and it seemed that the lack of sealed doors had actually allowed the flooding to spread out in such a way that the list had corrected itself overnight, and the ship was now on an even keel, at least from port to starboard. The bombers, armed with 1,000-pound bombs who'd been unable to attack the previous day, were then summoned. 11 aircraft, 6 from the Army and 5 from the Navy, showed up, and the Army planes opened the action, although it took them just over half an hour to score their first hit. At this point, the orders for the tests said that the ship should be inspected, as these larger bombs were anticipated to do a lot more damage, and the boarding party was thus dispatched when the Army bombers, in complete disregard of the revocation of the all clear, swept around for another pass. Frantically, the lead bomber was radioed and informed the observing party was now heading in and they should cease bombing. The bomber pilot, staggeringly, simply answered that, well, they'd let the Navy know when it was safe to board, an act of such ridiculous disregard for the chain of command as to be pretty much an instant career ender had the two parties been in the same service, but of course the observers were Navy and the pilot was Army. The inspection party therefore had to haul about and head for safety as more 1,000-pound high-explosive bombs rained down. 20 minutes and 2 more hits later, the Army aircraft apparently had run out of bombs and decided to head off, signalling that, well, now it was safe to board. The Navy bombers were then ordered to head home and rearm themselves with 2,000-pounders, much as the Army bombers would no doubt be doing at this instant. With Mitchell's almost criminally reckless airmen guaranteed to now be away for a few hours, the boarding party could examine the damage they'd done. They found the 3 direct hits had done essentially nothing to affect the ship's ability to fight. The near misses, though, had aggravated the existing flooding, and without most of the watertight doors closed and no pumps or any other power, the ship had settled another 2 feet by the stern. By the time this had all been determined, the bombers were on their way back, carrying experimental 2,000-pounders. The orders for the test stated that the Navy's aircraft were now due to attack first, with both Navy and Army formations allowed to drop 3 bombs and/or score 2 hits, whichever came first, before observation parties would go aboard again to assess the damage. However, Mitchell now decided to violate orders completely, ordering the Army aircraft to full throttle, thus meaning they arrived ahead of the Navy aircraft, and then signalling to observing ships below that his aircraft would not stop attacking until they dropped at least 1 bomb each, and if that failed to secure 2 hits, they were just going to keep going until 2 hits had been made. This was, of course, as mentioned, a direct violation of the orders for the test, and this intention was transmitted just as the lead aircraft started in on its attack run, which of course gave nobody a chance to say anything, including countermanding the attack. 11 bombers, 8 NBS-1s and 3 Handley Page 0400s, each armed with a single bomb, began to attack one after the other. The first 2 bombs missed, The third hit the ship directly. The fourth bounced off the ship's port side and exploded alongside. Even by Mitchell's suddenly imposed changes of the rules, they'd scored 2 hits, and that should have caused a cessation of bombing, but the Army aircraft just kept going, and soon a couple more bombs landed close to the ship, also on the port side. She now began to sink by the stern, then rolled over, and about 10 minutes later, finally slipped beneath the waves. Mitchell had thus disobeyed multiple direct orders, placed the lives of US servicemen in extreme jeopardy from live ammunition on at least 2 occasions, and all he'd achieved was to prove that if an old, obsolete dreadnought with practically zero watertight integrity was allowed to halfway flood itself overnight, with no defensive armament or working pumps, happened to be in good weather, didn't move to evade or sail in any direction at all, and had its exact position hand-fed to the Army Air Service, they could just about manage to put enough holes in the ship to finish it off, even though it turned out they couldn't hit the literal broadside of a barn most of the time, and ended up having to rely on the lucky mining effect of large-capacity high-explosive bombs landing nearby, an effect which more modern capital ships that actually had anti-torpedo defences would almost certainly be largely immune to. The first part, disobeying orders and putting lives in danger, would have seen him fired immediately once the chief naval officer finished writing out a rather acerbic letter of complaint, but Mitchell was saved, for now, by the press getting a hold of the story, and it was decided in the middle of that particular firestorm that in the interests of not looking like they were getting rid of someone who seemed, at least to the uninformed, to have just proven his point, the matter was quietly dropped, at least for now. Mitchell had, however, made enemies not just in the Navy, but also in the Army, and his continued insubordination would see him court-martialed and forced into retirement a few years later. Ultimately, the sinking of the Ostfriesland actually proved nothing for Mitchell's arguments. The direct hits had scarcely affected any of the target ships' fighting power, at least any of the larger ships, and the near misses that had done damage had acted as if they were mines. And the Navy already knew that an old ship without substantial underwater defences would be in trouble if it was hit by 3 or 4 mines. So that was nothing extraordinary. If the Ostfriesland or the Iowa had been operational and moving at speed, the simple fact was that they probably wouldn't have been found at all. They definitely would have completed any bombardment mission they might have had, and they most likely would have been back out beyond the anemic range of the bombers before anyone could do anything about it. And had they been found, more by luck than judgment, the odds of actually hitting them would have been slim. So too would history show Mitchell to be wrong on almost every count of his assertions, save one, that being the general one that aircraft would eventually develop to a point where they could threaten the existence of warships, even the mighty battleships. But not only was that point 2 decades in the future, but even then Mitchell's favoured tactic of level bombing with large high-explosive bombs was shown in fact to be utterly futile. Not a single capital ship was sunk in this manner in World War II, or even especially damaged. Indeed, scarcely any ship of any scale was sunk while underway by level bombing of any kind, whether you were using high-explosive or armour-piercing bombs. The only ships which took any real damage at all from level bombing were, like Ostfriesland, stationary, usually in port, and often subject to either mass saturation attacks or involved the use of novel weapons, such as the giant tall boys, or in the case of the one capital ship that was actually destroyed while underway in what was, technically speaking, a level bombing attack, it needed a remote-guided weapon, specifically the Fritz X armour-piercing bombs that sank the Italian battleship Roma. The aerial threat against capital ships would instead manifest itself primarily from the 2 weapons, armour-piercing bombs and torpedoes, which Mitchell had dismissed as ineffective, and they were delivered using the tactics which he either likewise dismissed or simply didn't conceive of, low-level torpedo bombing and dive bombing, respectively. In fact, it could even be argued that Mitchell's efforts were doubly counterproductive. In the short term, this and other stunts that he pulled off, such as a simulated bombing of New York, ended up driving Congress to mandate and pay for the conversion of the Lexington and Saratoga into aircraft carriers, strengthening the very navy that Mitchell had sought to supplant. And in the longer term, the massive flaws in his experiments ended up forming the opinions of many naval officers against the idea of air power being any real threat, which of course then had a knock-on impact on the importance placed on aircraft and anti-aircraft guns in a number of fleets, primarily of course the United States Navy, which would in turn likely be the root cause of the loss of a number of ships in the early part of World War II, which might otherwise have found themselves somewhat better defended. Of course, there is a flip side to that argument, which is that as the result of the supposedly decisive test against Ostfriesland, a good many air forces persisted with the hilariously ineffective tactic of level bombing moving ships for far longer than they realistically should have, which no doubt preserved a good number of ships and their crews, where a considerably larger and earlier investment in dive or torpedo bombers may have seen those ships sent to the bottom. So, what do you think? Was Mitchell an early prophet of aviation, just unappreciated in his time? Or was he a false messiah, who just so happened to manage to make one vaguely accurate prediction amidst a sea of lies?
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.